Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryen, Senior Director of the JPC, and your host, and a guest today as well. Actually, it's not altogether a good afternoon, okay? Despite the optimism over President Trump's Gaza plan, and we share the optimism, we don't see any hostages yet. And we just passed the second anniversary of 10/7, the art sites of more than 1,200 people in Israel, tortured, raped, mutilated, murdered by Hamas and its minions. So I would ask for a moment of silence, please, for the victims of 10/7 and for the many IDF soldiers who have worked bravely and boldly and carefully to bring the hostages home. A moment of silence, please. Thank you. So there are two of us today, partly because I can't keep my mouth shut. No, actually, it's because Eric Rozenman is one of my favorite people and go-to analysts, and I wanted this opportunity to interact with him. So a quick intro to the JPC and then us. The Jewish Policy Center provides analysis of foreign and domestic policies. We support strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. Most importantly, today and every day, we support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. And now more than ever, we support the efforts of the government of Israel and the IDF to defend the people of Israel on all of its borders, and when necessary, beyond those borders. We support justice in Gaza, which may start with the return of the hostages, but it doesn't end there. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, we also have a domestic agenda. We advocate for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles and the fall issue of our magazine, inFOCUS Quarterly, which is called Borders, Identity, and Conflict. I hope you like it. You can also binge watch our previous webinar programs. And now, our guest. Eric Rozenman was, until last year, communications consultant here at the JPC, and he is presently associate editor of inFOCUS Quarterly. His work in the Jewish community spans Camera, B'nai B'rith, and Jinsa, as well as the Washington Jewish Week and Near East Report. He is, in his spare time, an author. He wrote From Elvis to Trump, Eyewitness to the Unraveling, co-starring Richard Nixon, Andy Warhol, Bill Clinton, the Supremes, and Barack Obama. That's a great title. It's as long as the book is. And he also wrote Jews Make the Best Demons, Palestine, and the Jewish Question. Most recently, he has a new book called The David Discovery, which is reviewed by me in the current issue of inFOCUS Quarterly. Let me just say to you, buy it. It is a great book by Eric's The David Discovery. And now, the president's plan. So I want to start with the hostages. We all pray for their return, but I've been overwhelmed by the number of people who are proclaiming victory in the war before a single hostage is actually released. It also bears mentioning that our own Jewish tradition calls for watching out how much you pay for hostages. I'm going to quote Amit Siegel from Channel 12 in Israel. You see him occasionally on our website. This is the important part. The agreement signed in Egypt is not a Gaza reconstruction or demilitarization plan. It is purely about hostages and a temporary ceasefire. All the talk about international oversight, Amit writes, tunnel dismantling, and Tony Blair running Gaza. None of it's in the text. And now to move on from Amit Siegel, what's in the text is Israel's 3 war aims, and we're going to talk about those. So be careful about making the deal something it isn't. Wait for the hostages. Move on to the next things when the next things come. But there are some really important things to get to now. And I'm going to ask Eric to jump in here by starting with, this is the last war, right? Eric, this is the last war. Tell us why.
It's the last war under the conditions that we are used to thinking about Israel's wars against Hamas and its allies earlier against the PLO and against Arab countries. And the reason it's the last war, or a major reason why it's the last one, or those conditions, is that we are in TikTok world now. If in the 2008 or 2012 presidential election, a poll showed that something like a majority of people, Americans under 30, got their news primarily from the Jon Stewart's Daily Show, not from any of what we considered traditional or mainstream news media. That already is the past. Now, it turns out, according to some polls I have read about, that most younger people, and now we're talking about people under 35, even 40, their primary source of news information is their social media feeds, which means they're looking at short videos or comments that other people, just as ill-informed as they are, or perhaps as propagandized, are repeating. So it's the last war under which Israel and the United States policymakers, military planners can assume that the publics that they represent or are fighting for have anything like the same information or consensus about what is going on. And secondly, it's the last war given divisions in America, political divisions, party divisions, and according to a Washington Post poll that the Post put on the front page last Sunday, in which 61% of American Jews are said to believe Israel has committed war crimes in Gaza, and 39% are said to believe Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. This is basically the Hamas propaganda indoctrination sunk deep. It's the last war in which Israel can assume that the American Jewish community, or at least a big majority, or even a strong plurality, might rally behind it for political support in the United States. So, last war under those conditions. And first war, if you have a Venn diagram and you think of these two as overlapping, the negative change in information flow, but overlapping, as we saw from Israel's military and intelligence decimation of Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, control of terrorists in Judea and Samaria, actions in Syria and in Iran. This is the first war in which Israel has operated far beyond its borders, stealthily as well as overtly, to such great success. So you've got on this hand bad, on that hand good. But we're in a new world, and I hope Israeli planners and American planners understand that.
Yeah, I want to point out too, though, yes, I agree that this is a new world, a new war, a new way of doing things. But one of the positive things that we see is the lineup of players, and you just said it. You said Israel operated beyond its borders and operated stealthily, and it removed Hezbollah from Lebanon, and it made Iran look very weak. It took Syria out of that equation. There are other problems with Syria, but okay, took it out of that equation. On the one hand, you had performance art by France, the UK, Spain, and the Netherlands, all of which were huge colonizers of the Middle East, of Africa, of South America, big colonizers, supported by Canada and Australia, former colonies of the above mentioned, and a few other irrelevants. Okay, that's on the one side. And we always thought of ourselves as like on that side. The Europeans were friends of Israel, friends of the United States, friends of ours. However, in this case, President Trump was sitting and Israel was sitting, not only the US and Israel, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Turkey, plus, kind of oddly, Pakistan and Indonesia. These are all countries that know a lot more about the region, know a lot more about the bad guys, meaning the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic Jihad, those are the people you want on your side. And Israel clearly has them on their side now. So I think it's, in more than one way, a new world. And in that particular way, it's a good new world. Talk about Qatar, Eric. I know you want to.
Qatar. It's just amazing how successfully, and it has played a double game, usually being both the funder, major funder of Hamas, hosting for now a couple of decades Al Jazeera, which has basically been the mothership of Islamic fundamentalist propaganda beamed to hundreds of millions of people throughout the Middle East, Asia, and into Europe and beyond. And at the same time, hosting a major American military base. This is overtly, and being declared by the Biden administration a major non-NATO ally. And at the same time, as near as we can tell from a number of published reports lately, and I want to name two individuals in particular, Lenny Ben David in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, our old friend, and another of our newer, younger friends, Sean Derns at Camera in the Washington Examiner, tracing the paper trail of, and they aren't the only ones, but these are prominent, of Qatar's funding to the tune of several $billion, American universities, think tanks, influencers, from registered foreign agents to unregistered social media influencers, people, the old myth of Jewish control of the media, to which I say, if only, if you could, if the Jewish lobby, if the Zionist conspiracy could do what Qatar has done in the United States with money and lobbyists and influencers in opinion-making institutions, universities, think tanks, we would not be having this conversation in the same way, because we would have been having pro-Israel encampments on college campuses. So Qatar, double game. And in Egypt now, in these negotiations, and always in the negotiations between, as a go-between between Hamas and the US and Israel, Qatar on the one time acts as a go-between, and on the other hand, it's Hamas's lawyer. So it's amazing. And it's out in plain sight. It's basically naked, and they get away with it.
It is. I got 3 points on Qatar, though. Clearly, it owns Al Jazeera, and that makes it major propagandist in the world, particularly in the Arab and Muslim world, but also among US media outlets. Al Jazeera was considered very important. Al Jazeera has toned down its criticism of Israel, toned down its support of Hamas, toned down a lot of things. And it appears that President Trump told the Qataris to do that. And I think that's very important. I wish you could make them sell it, but I think you can't. The other two things are Netanyahu's so-called apology to Qatar. I want to be clear about what he actually did. He did not apologize for coming after Hamas in Qatar. He didn't. He apologized for the death of a Qatari security guard who was in that office building, and that's perfectly appropriate. He apologized also for the violation of their borders, but not why they did it. And so those are two really important things to understand. And second is President Trump's pledge to defend Qatar, protect Qatar, which people assumed meant, well, he's told Bibi not to attack them again. No, that is not right. Qatar has no fear of an attack by Israel. It knows it's not going to happen. What the president was doing, and here he gets major points, telling Qatar, come on our side because we will protect you from Iran. Iran threatens Qatar every single day, and that's why Qatar has been a sort of toady of Iran. It's afraid of it, and it doesn't like Saudi Arabia much either, but it doesn't like Iran. And this is the promise to protect Qatar from Iran. That's what Everybody needs to understand. All of those guys who sat with the president see Iran still weakened, degraded, whatever you want to say. Iran is still the enemy. Israel is not the enemy. Iran is the enemy. And that's going to get dealt with. It's going to have to be dealt with in time coming up. So now we get to the actual deal of the century. Have we got the deal of the century? You said something interesting about the Abraham Accords. So tell us how you felt about President Trump's last deal of the century, Eric.
Yes, this is the appropriate moment for me to remind myself and in our audience the old Jewish saying that since the fall of the Second Temple, prophecy's been given only to infants and fools. So in reverse prophecy, disclaimer, when I first heard that in the first Trump administration, that the president was dispatching his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and one of his lawyers, David Friedman, I believe, to the Middle East to arrange the deal of the century between Israel and the Palestinians, I just threw up my hands and thought, what narkite, what nonsense is this? This will never work. And for me to say that, somebody who has basically spent half of his career saying, don't let the State Department have anything to do with trying to solve the Arab-Israeli problem. It's like, okay, I don't want them to do it, and I don't want them to do it. Well, I was wrong, wasn't I? I never thought that the Abraham Accords or anything like it would come out of sending Jared Kushner and David Friedman, and I forget the other fellow, another longtime lawyer for President Trump in the business world, to the Middle East. Okay, I was wrong, really wrong. Having said that,
a very unusual occurrence, I will say. Go ahead.
Yes, it's true. As my father liked to say, I thought I made a mistake once, but I was wrong. Okay. Now, the deal of the century now. I will say this, though. Maybe it's from the old, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. When I looked at all 20 points, and I know we are talking really only about the first three, which are essentially Israel's war aims, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, and that's all to the positive, and all credit to President Trump and to Prime Minister Netanyahu. When I start reading the rest of them, I immediately default to Beirut 1982 and the way Israel had Yasser Arafat and 10,000 PLO gunmen surrounded in Beirut under siege. And at that moment, the United States, under the Reagan administration, the Europeans, even the Pope, and that was Pope John Paul II, normally usually a very solid, sounds funny to say about a Pope, but a very solid Cold Warrior, as with Reagan and Thatcher and Lech Walesa, the four people who really pried that lever under the Soviet Union and cracked that shell. But they stepped in to rescue Arafat, the PLO, who got to sail away to Tunis and other places, disarm. And we know how that worked out. And I look at the rest of this plan and I just think, Beirut 1982.
Okay. It seems that when you get down to points, 9, 10, 11, 15, that happens. But I will say, in terms of going in and why I actually disagreed with you, rare moment, on the Abraham Accords, is that what we were seeing in the Abraham Accords was the Trump mechanism. He has a mechanism for doing what he does. And what he does is throw out all the positives that people could achieve by listening to him and doing what he wants them to do. You can have peace, you can have prosperity, you can have security, you can have all these sorts of great things and hell will break loose if you don't. And that's the way he goes. Now, sometimes it works. The Abraham Accords countries were ready for that, and they said yes. He offered the same to Armenia and Azerbaijan, and it appears to have worked. He offered it to Rwanda and the DRC, and that also appears to have worked. However, it doesn't always. He offered Ukraine, the US presence in Ukraine in the mining deal. They rejected it. Russia has declined his offers. China has not been especially welcoming. Mexico has been more. Canada has been less. So I don't know what made him think that Hamas would agree. And I think that's part of what brought you to, let's get 3 points first. And just as a reminder, the 3 points are securing the borders with Israeli troops to protect the people of Israel, eliminating the military and governing power of Hamas, and returning all the hostages, living and past. These allow for the ceasefire. Then we get to other things, like sort of foolish things, you know, the idea that the Europeans would work in Gaza in a security force. I forget the name of it. It's got some very bizarre acronym, but the Europeans were in Rafah, securing the border of Gaza after Israel pulled out in 2005, and they were helping the Egyptians, so they were going to make, you know, Gaza fine and Rafah fine. And it clearly didn't work. And the Euros left. I mean, they just pulled out. They forget it, I'm not doing this. And then there's the, you know, the story that we know about Egypt and Rafah and things that went into Gaza that weren't supposed to go into Gaza. So the idea that the Europeans have a part of this, I don't think so. But maybe if you stretch it out, you give the Palestinians a chance to figure out what they want. I heard this morning that there is some armed uprising in Gaza by people against Hamas. 5 people have been killed already. I suspect more people will be killed because Hamas is not prepared to give up its control of the people. And by the way, I would say that some people don't mind being controlled by Hamas. You also see video today of Gazans dancing in the street, proclaiming their victory, which is really interesting for survivors of genocide and famine and Holocaust and all that, to be dancing in the street and filming it with their phones. So I don't know where we are, but I think the main thing that we can say is that by next Tuesday, when the hostages are meant to be back in Israel, we will have some understanding here. So, by the way, uprising in Gaza reminds me of something else. Palestinians uprising against Palestinian strong-arm people, terrorist people. I don't know. Tell us about the village leagues, Eric. Remind us where we were once with the village leagues.
Well, Israel and secondarily the United States were looking for an alternative to PLO leadership over the Palestinians, and particularly in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. And this was in the, I guess, mid-'80s. The concept of the village leagues, or the sons of the village, was that clan-based movements, in particular towns, villages, Arab Palestinian municipalities, would, separate from the PLO, would be responsible for basically self-administration, sort of the concept that ended up in the Camp David Accords and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, self-rule. And there were senior Israeli figures, and especially academics, who explained why this was going to work or why this could work. But of course, what happened was a combination of PLO murder, violence, and intimidation, and the village league concept never really took hold. And it was not taking hold at the same time that the PLO had already in the 70s been declared by the Arab League and then by the UN basically as, quote, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. I can remember, Shoshana, you and I have been writing about and talking about these general issues, Arab-Israeli, Israeli-Palestinian, U.S.-Israel issues. I was just thinking about this before the webinar. At least, shall I say it, half our lifetime, since 1989, 36 years we've been on this together, sometimes in adjoining offices. And I remember writing about the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Well, gee, yeah, that's like the Communist Party is the sole legitimate representative of the Soviet people. But who's the sole legitimate representative of the American people or of the Israeli people or the Brits or the French? Oh, well, real countries with real democracies don't have sole legitimate representatives. And as soon as the PLO got that title, you know, the game wasn't about helping the Palestinians. It was about smoothing diplomatic relations for countries that were worried about terrorism or oil, interrupt oil embargoes and so on. So Hamas, how do you pry Hamas off of, if you regard them as an imposition, the Palestinians in Gaza? Well, this plan,
or can you? I'm not sure you can.
Yeah, and I was going to say, if you can, then the 20-point plan, some of these subsidiary points, aspirationally, sound like the way to go. But given that all the released hostages tell similar stories about no empathy, no sympathy, no human kindness from their captors, even the people who were held in private houses originally, there are only a few isolated examples of people saying, oh yeah, when no one else was looking, that guard brought me extra food. Or when no one else was looking, that family gave me a blanket. But that's extremely, extremely rare. So maybe you don't pry them off. Then you come to peace education for the people in Gaza, which reminds me of the Oslo Accords and the Palestinian commitment to peace education. Well, it never happened.
Okay, here's where your pessimism and my less pessimism, but still pessimism, comes into play. We have seen, not you and I, because we're not old enough, but people still living have seen the effect of World War II, the Allied defeat of Germany and Japan, and there were no ideologies more disgusting than those. Imperial Japan and the emperor as God and the rights of Japanese to do whatever they wanted in Asia, and Nazism, and we know what that meant. So you have to ask the question, how did we move from Germany and Japan as the kind of vile, disgusting, vampirish regimes that they were, to peaceful, democratic countries, allies of the United States, friends of Israel, by the way. I mean, I give Chancellor Merz a lot of credit for holding the line in Germany, and Japan has said it will not recognize the Palestinians. How did we get there? We got there, first of all, by defeating them. Second, and ensuring that they knew they were defeated, they acknowledged that they were defeated, but also by occupying them and changing their laws, their constitutions, their educational system, making it trying and hanging some people. I mean, that was, that was also important. Making it impolitic, to use an odd word, to be a Nazi or a Japanese empire lover in that space. Did we eradicate Nazism? Is it no? No. Did we make it unacceptable for people to go out in public with those views? Yes. And then as you raise the next generation of people with different views, Nazism among Germans and emperor's God, and I don't know what they call it, imperialism in Japan, became less and less relevant to the people of those places. And so you can't say it can't be done, because worse people, believe me, there were worse people in history than Hamas. Worse people have come around. The question is who can do it to them. Israel cannot provide that for them. I suspect, however, that the UAE, which underwent a tremendous transformation from rabid, violent Islam to something more mature in 21st century. Arabs can do it. They speak the language. They've had the experience. Saudis have had the experience. Let me just say, our guest next week is David Shanker, Levantist, and one of my favorite speakers. Not greater than you, Arab, probably, but David Shanker. David Shanker tells a great story about being in Saudi Arabia. I don't know, probably 8 or 9 years ago, and going to the Saudi National Museum. And the one thing he said that was missing from the National Museum of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was Wahhabis. They took them out. They simply removed the Wahhabis from Saudi history and Saudi politics and the Saudi presence. And that tells you that they understand these things. So yes, the village leagues got wiped out, mostly because the West insisted that the PLO was legitimate. The West insisted that this is how we go. The US is not insisting on that anymore. And I think if the British and the French are smart, they'll give it up.
But if I can interject, yes, but here, this might even be a no, but I'm sorry to say. So Germany in 1945 is laid waste by the Allies. It's occupied. It has no power to resist at all anymore. But Germany before 1933 and the takeover, the electoral takeover, and then dictatorial takeover by the Nazi Party, Germany had been a Christian country, had democratic forms, no matter whether they weren't necessarily very efficient, but Germany was already in the West. Japan, we dropped 2 atomic bombs on them. We tell them oh, by the way, here's your new constitution, and by the way, the emperor's not a god, and we sit there with an occupation army, just like we had 350,000 American troops, not to mention British and French, in West Germany. Israel doesn't have the power to do that in West Bank, Judea and Samaria, or Gaza Strip. It doesn't probably even have the social unity to be able to take on such a role. So the denazification of Palestinian society is a little different, even from the Saudis removing their founding. The Wahhabis to Saudi Arabia were what the Puritans and the Pilgrims were to the United States, and we can't very well rip them out of American history and go on as if it were the same thing. Well, Palestinian Arab national identity, as we've discussed often for a long time and written for a long time, and no doubt we can find our articles on the JPC site saying so, Palestinian Arab national identity is not something beside Zionist Jewish national identity. It's in place of. If they have to give that up, if they are peace education, reconciliation, all these other points, they become somebody that they are not now. That's Palestinians who never picked up a gun, who never raised a terrorist child. It's a mindset. And I just think that is not the same task. It is such a much bigger, harder version of that.
I would agree that it is a harder version. And I'll drop in here 2 questions that listeners have sent to us, both of whom want to discuss the role of religion. Yes, Nazism was a religion in its way, but Germans were still Christians. Yeah, religion is a big deal here. But if you assume, and I actually did at one point, but I don't anymore, that Islam is fully and completely what the radicals say it is. Islam is what the Muslim Brotherhood says. Islam is what ISIS says. Islam is what the Taliban says. I think you're making a mistake, because watch Indonesia. Islam in Asia followed a different path. Part of the problem, as I understand it, as I see it, is that the narrative is controlled by the radicals. And that is very hard to get rid of, unless perhaps you see that the radicals are failing. There are parts of Islam and ways of reading the Quran or reading about Islam that are not Arab identity, that are a religion, not an Arab cultural identity. In fact, in the Quran, Jerusalem is referred to as the holy city of the Jews. It is not referred to as the holy city of Muslims. It is not. So my guess is one of the things that the world needs is more people to actually study Islam and the Quran and be able to differentiate Arab nationalism, Arab Jew hatred, which arises far too often, in my opinion, and the religious teachings of Islam. And that's got to be done, and not done by Jews, not done by Americans, not done by Europeans, because we all bring our cultural biases to it. It's got to be done by.
I definitely agree. And it's funny, the Saudis, your reference to the Saudis, what they've done now, it's kind of a full circle in that there was a wonderful book in the late 70s, early 80s, I read in the early 80s, V.S. Naipaul, Among the Believers. And he spent a fair amount of time in 4 countries. One was Indonesia, one was Saudi Arabia, I think Iran, and probably Egypt, off the top of my head, but definitely Saudi Arabia and Indonesia. And it was clear that Indonesia, which is the most populous Muslim country in the world, that Islam that he found in Indonesia was a much more, Western word here, moderate form of Islam than what he found in Saudi Arabia, or I believe Iran. So yeah, maybe unitary, but not uniform. But the funny thing that happened was, of course, the Saudis funded all these radical madrasas in Indonesia and other places that ended up causing helping cause the local versions of Islam to become radicalized after 9/11. And the Saudis realized that they had spawned a demon that threatened them as well. They pulled back the funding for that kind of operation. That's where the Qataris came in, of course, to replace the Saudis with that malevolent funding. So yes, your point about Islam is excellent and needs to be taken into account. But you also touched on the Arab identity. The really toxic thing for Zionism, for Jews to live as sovereign equals in the Middle East, is the combination of, we'll say, fundamentalist Islam and Arabism, especially Pan-Arabism. If the 20-point plan that the president has under his name, if that were to be realized, would separate a little bit the toxic connection of Islamic radicalism and Arab extremism. And then you get to where you want to be.
Where do I want to be? Where do I want to be? I'll tell you where I want to be.
Good.
We have great listeners because Ed, thank you. Ed sent us a question and says, when do we get to discuss the president's plan? So this is great because the listeners are going to drag us right back into where we ought to be. And I know that we have said the first 3 points of the plan are the points of the plan that we like. Those are, in my opinion, president can have a Nobel Peace Prize for that. But you have some thoughts about other points in the plan. I strongly encourage everybody to go read the 20 points. They are important points, even if they're not being taken up now. Go read them. Eric, give me an idea of what's going on in those other 20 points.
Point 5, quote, once all the hostages are released, Israel will release 250 life sentence prisoners, I have written in my own parentheses, murderers, plus 1,700 Gazans who were detained after October 7, 2023, including all women and children detained in that context. for every Israeli hostage. Okay, there's more, but that's to me the main point here. If that kind of hostage release, Israel's been through that. If you go back to the 48 war and prisoner exchanges, these exchanges where a few Israelis are traded for hundreds or thousands of Arab prisoners, Palestinians, and as we saw in 2011, for example, and that wasn't the only time, over 1,000 terrorists, Palestinian Arab terrorists, people with blood on their hands, exchanged for Ghalid Shalit, one long-term captured Israeli soldier in Gaza. Among those released was Yahya Sinwar, the leader, the subsequently leader of Hamas in Gaza, and planner, major planner of the October 7 horrors. If Hamas may be battered, beaten, Gaza devastated because of Hamas, and they get these 250 people back, murderers, is that not a major victory? And if one of them is Marwan Barghouti, who they have been demanding and the Palestinian Authority has been demanding, Barghouti is serving multiple life sentences in Israeli prisons for planning multiple murders during the Second Intifada. He, far more than Mahmoud Abbas, is the real natural heir to Yasser Arafat. This kind of trade guarantees, in my opinion, and lots of other people's, more terrorism down the road. Yes, to get the hostages back is a giant relief. To turn 250 of these people loose guarantees a rerun, a sequel in the future.
And if they don't go back to Gaza, they're going to be supported in other countries. So either they go back to a poverty-stricken Gaza where the Israelis are standing right on top of them, which is bad enough because they will have support inside. But if you send them to other countries, if you send them to Europe, if you send them to Afghanistan where they have a ton of money and people who think like they think, you could be setting up for the future. So,
and if I could make one more quick, the questioner wants us to talk about the 20 points. Look at point 13. Quote, Hamas and other factions agree to not have any role in the governance of Gaza directly, indirectly, or in any other form. Quote, I have made a note on my copy of the 20 points. Please. Hamas took over the Gaza Strip from the Palestinian Authority in, 2006? In a 5-day war in which it killed over 100 Palestinian Authority officials, supporters, etc. Unless this international stabilization force that's called for on other points is prepared to act like the IDF against Hamas, Hamas will find a way to have a role, in fact, the leading role, if not the only role, in ruling Gaza. Somebody's got to be prepared to be, if it's not going to be the IDF, somebody else has got to be prepared to behave like the IDF.
So you need an enforcer. You need an enforcer. Okay. So now we've seen two sets of problems, both of which come from, I don't want to say leaving Hamas standing because it doesn't actually do that, but leaving them in a position where time works on their side. So if people think that this is the end of the war, and I saw a lot of people today referring to this as a victory, it is a victory, but it's also possibly an interregnum before the next war. And that, unfortunately, has been the case for every Israel war. The 48 war, was it a victory? Well, I suppose in some ways it was, but it was also the prelude to 56, 67, 73, the rocket wars, the terror wars, and all these other things. So there are ways that Israel's enemies morph, and there is in some of those aspirational points of the plan, and this is why I didn't want to go too far in the plan, because they are, as I say, aspirational. They're not agreed to. They don't take account of the morphability, the transfiguration ability of terrorist groups, and I think you have to do that. And you also mentioned, by the way, the stabilization force. What is a stabilization force? As I mentioned, the Europeans had what they considered a border security force in Gaza. And there was both a police force and a military force. There were two separate sets, and they sent them there. And I suspect they sent them there with I don't know, decent expectations that they would be successful. Or maybe not, but anyway, they sent them. But they only lasted until it was clear that Hamas didn't want them there, and then they ran for cover. So a stabilization force, as is in the points, means nothing until you know who's going to do the stabilizing. And as you say, it's got to be IDF-ish, but it's highly unlikely that the IDF will be the stabilization force. I don't see them inside of Gaza. Borders, yes. Inside Gaza, no. So that leaves us with a problem. Any other points that are problematic?
Yes. I'll focus on one. Point 19, because while it is narrow and focused in a way, and very well worded. If you are a supporter of Israel, if you are an American supporter of Israel or an Israeli, it's actually artfully and well worded. However, it points aspirationally, keeping alive, reinflating the dreaded two-state solution, quote unquote. When I say dreaded, I mean this. 1979, I'm on a tour of Israel. At this point, I have not worked for any pro-Israel organization. I have not been involved in Jewish organizational life. I am an honest young newspaper reporter from Columbus, Ohio. And I'm on a tour with some Moshavniks. And went to tour of Judea and Samaria, a one-day bus tour. And it's late afternoon, and we stop on this hilltop, which is a new settlement at the time. There's 4 or 5 caravans, what Israelis call caravans, we call house trailers, and a parking lot. And our bus rolls up in the parking lot and stops, and the Moshavniks get out and in good Jewish, Israeli Jewish fashion, immediately start arguing with their hosts, the settlers. What are you doing here? You don't belong here. This causes a problem. And it's in Hebrew, and my Hebrew's never passed beyond like remedial kindergarten. I know they're arguing with other passionately, yes and no, but I drift away and I look to the east. Sun is starting to go down, and I see this really shiny surface off to the east and down. It's the Dead Sea. Without moving my feet, but just turning around to look to the west, I see a big shiny surface. Sinking sun is glittering off of, and lights starting to come on in a line. I'm looking at the lights of northern Tel Aviv come on at night, and the shimmering Mediterranean Sea. Without binoculars, unaided, I am looking across 40 miles from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and the place I'm standing in is now, today, Ariel, the city of Ariel with 25,000 people and a university. And it's like 18, 19 miles from Tel Aviv, and it's 20, 25 miles from the Dead Sea. There is no room, and has never been any room in that territory for 2 sovereign states of people. And that would be maybe not true if they were Belgians and Dutch. They're not Belgians and Dutch. So this point 19, it talks about recognizing as the aspirations of the Palestinian people progress. The United States recognizes this is an aspiration that is 2 states statehood as an aspiration of the Palestinian people. Well, self-rule, okay. That was Camp David, 1979, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And the Palestinians, the PLO didn't want it. Self-rule, yes, we hope, maybe. Autonomy, sovereignty, no. There can only be one sovereign force there, and it has to be Israel over all that territory.
Okay, so let me point out that Benny Gantz, who had been not unsympathetic to the concept of two states, wrote a piece in the New York Times recently in which he said, forget it. There is no interest in Israel, no support in Israel for a sovereign Palestinian state now. Forget it. Not on the left, not in the center, and there never was on the right. So this is Benny Gantz, and he was he's a general. You know, he knows a little bit about the security aspect of this, but he's also center left in the Israeli context, and he's wiped it out. So it leaves us with two things. One is just to say to ourselves, okay, it's aspirational, it's never coming, you know, right? You can do that. But there's another concept. And for those of you who have been listening to this program over time, you know that we've had Barry Shaw from Israel and Colonel David Katz, an American security specialist, former special forces, talk about the concept of a protectorate. A protectorate being a perfectly legitimate mechanism in the world. France has 14 of them. And by the way, New Caledonia wants to be independent, and France said no. So, you know, so much for the French and people's national aspirations. New Caledonia poses exactly what threat to France? All right, never mind. Protectorate, a way to make small groups of people safe and secure in their small grouphood and not pose threats to anybody else. The UAE is called the United Arab Emirates because it is a collection of 9 emirates. They are different emirates. They are different people. They are ruled. Why not a protectorate? The clans of Hebron have already said they don't want to be ruled by Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. Clans of Hebron cover like 700,000 people in the Hebron larger area. Why not that thought, where people could connect to relatives in Jordan, people could connect to other people in Judea and Samaria? Any thought on protectorates? No.
Yes, sounds good. Sounds good to me. I don't speak Arabic and I don't worship in a mosque, but it sounds good to me.
It sounds like something that one could put forward in the expectation that you could have a conversation. It's unlikely, according to Benny Gantz, as well as to you, that you're going to have much of a conversation on a two-state solution, two-sovereign state solution. He's where you are, and I suspect he is correct that 99% of the Israeli public is in the same place. But the concept of a protectorate at least gives you something to talk about. And that makes one of the president's points less aspirational and more discussable. Okay. So somebody now throws in a question to us and says, what are the requirements of Hamas or the Palestinians in the 20 points, and what is the likelihood of them being accomplished? I think we know here that the likelihood of the first 3 points being accomplished is pretty decent. The next several points, maybe. But again, aspiration is aspiration, and I don't think that the president meant for this to be the end of the conversation, which raises another 2 questions that people sent in. One is a political question, and it's for you, Eric, and I'm going to trust you not to go, over the edge on politics. But the questioner points out that the election of more Democrats and perhaps a Democratic president could change the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship, given where the Democratic Party is going. And you alluded to that in the beginning. So you want to talk about that without getting our tax status in trouble?
Yeah, that was like the third point of why this is the last war under the circumstances of which we are used to thinking about Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. That is, when I worked at APAC in the edited Near East report mid-late 1980s, when it was actually a printed weekly newsletter, it was easy. It was the days of the Israeli National Unity Government. And so the Israeli side was more or less, if temporarily, unified. And in America, the shift between Republicans harboring, the late Maury Amate used to tell me there were 25 members of the 25 really anti-Israel members of Congress in the late 1980s. Most of them were Republicans. By the time we got to the late 90s, Maury was pointing out that most of the 25 worst members of Congress when it came to voting for Israel-related issues were Democrats. Well, that was already a generation ago. We know where the party has gone, unfortunately, or where the party activists, where the energy in the party has gone. So, in another administration, will Israel have the same military to military cooperation, support, resupply, intelligence sharing that it has had up to now, including this war, and that includes the war against Iran? Can't count on it. So that is a strategic issue. Israel has made great tactical gains since the horror of October 7, 2 years ago. Israel has made tremendous progress in removing the existential threat from the so-called ring of resistance or Shiite arc, Iranian arc around it. And yet, the danger that it will become isolated, I'm not so worried about the military or even diplomatic isolation. Its biggest trading partner, taken as a whole, is the European Union. And when you have the Prime Minister of Spain lamenting that he doesn't have nuclear weapons so that he could make Israel stop fighting in Gaza, and the Dutch saying that if Israel is allowed in the Eurovision Song Contest this year, it won't participate, you know you have a different order of a problem, and that can't continue.
So here I would just point out, as I said before, the Germans have been, interestingly, very, very good. They've announced that if Eurovision doesn't permit Israel to sing, the Germans are not coming.
Right.
The Austrians, who are hosting Eurovision this year, have said, if the Israelis don't participate, we're not hosting. That's a huge thing because there's a lot of money involved in Eurovision. Yes. And so let's give credit where it's due. We're coming close to the end, but a couple of thoughts here. Somebody asked about, and you just mentioned American isolation, that in fact, where we were withdrawing from the Middle East and where we were watching China and watching Russia and watching Iran build in the Middle East, that's over, folks. That is over. We have, as Amit Siegel said, and I quote him a lot, it's not clear whether there's going to be a lasting peace. And so the end of this conversation about the plan, it's not clear that there will be a lasting peace in the Middle East or that any really good things will happen beyond the worries. But America has emerged in the Middle East with Israel as the strong horse, on the same page, doing the same things, wanting the same things, and the Arabs and non-Arabs of the region understand that, and they will live with that. So I think that is a very positive note. Now, someone, maybe you have the answer to this one, Eric. I'm not sure. Ellen asks, you mentioned that young people get their information from different sources than we old folks used to do in the old days. If somebody said, where should I look? Where should they look for serious information? What's the good stuff?
Interestingly, this is probably the easiest question to answer and point to discuss of this webinar, this hour. You should be subscribing, any of us, all of us, should be subscribing for free to the daily alert from the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, which is actually prepared in Jerusalem by the Jerusalem Center, well, they changed the name, but the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. It's a compilation of news, reports, and commentary from all sorts of sources, Israeli, European, and when necessary, translated, English, UK, US. And what you get is a couple of paragraphs, summary, and a link to go to the full article if you want. And there are usually 10, 12 of these items. The daily, despite its name, the daily alert comes out 3 times a week. And it's wonderful. You read the daily alert, and if you just read the synopsis, 10 minutes, you will be way ahead of not only the people who watch network news, cable news, are on online sites. You'll be ahead of a lot of the analysts and policymakers. There's also, if you're really interested about Israel and Jewish affairs, Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, excellent. And the Allgemeiner, the old anti-Vorwärts or Yiddish newspaper, the name revived, online news and info, news and opinion site, the Allgemeiner, excellent. Start there.
Okay, so Ellen, I owe you an apology. I didn't read your question correctly. She actually asked which groups are posting on X and other sites where our youth goes. Too many to discuss, but I would point out, and this is a conversation for another time, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians and the Qataris all fund bots. They all fund things that aren't real, okay? But they tell you, A, I'm real, and B, let me give you the news, and C, the Israelis stink, and we're not fond of Jews either. All of this stuff is fraud. And one of the great questions of our time is ultimately going to be, how do we deal with the fact that social media is so replicative that you can go from 0 to 1 million in 7 seconds? I run our X post, and I will tell you who's posting, who cares. What you need to know is who's funding who's posting, because who's posting isn't real.
Shoshana.
Who's funding is real. So we've come to 1 o'clock.
Shoshana.
Go ahead.
I have to tell you, first, I forgot to pitch my book, which you suggested I should do at the beginning, but that goes right into this business about online sources and X, all the other social media platforms. So I have a new novel out. Normally I'm writing nonfiction, but I have a novel out, The David Discovery. If you're looking for the Jewish Da Vinci Code, I hope this will turn out to be that. As Shoshana mentioned, she reviewed it in the current issue of inFOCUS magazine. But so I was told, oh, you have a new book out? You must get an Instagram site. Don't advertise in print media. Go online and advertise on all the social media platforms. That's how you'll get readers. So I created an Instagram site. You know what I get? I get scores of invitations daily from AI generated young Japanese women dying to meet me.
Well, that should be interesting.
Yeah. It's not real. That world, that online world, a huge chunk of it is not real. And a lot of it's anti-Israel, anti-Jewish propaganda.
And so you need a social media expert to help you with that. We have come to the end of our hour. And as you know, I want to go out on a positive note. So I will. Eric, do you want to take a positive note? I mean, I've got one.
Absolutely. I mentioned it in passing, I guess, before. Israel, in the last 2 years, has removed the existential threat generated by Iran, led by Iran, hanging over it. For how long? We don't know. But it probably has at least a few years with a relatively open, at least regional field of running room. So the positive, it's there. I hope it takes advantage of it and doesn't make the mistake that it made after 1967 in assuming that it had won the long war and had taught the Arabs a lesson they wouldn't forget. Well, yeah, until the 1973 Yom Kippur attack. So right now, a huge window of opportunity that did not exist on October 6th, let alone October 7th, 2023, exists now. And that in itself is a big plus.
And I'm going to add to your plus by saying, and I agree with what created the plus, what is the plus. And I would say the other optimistic note is that we have more years of the current administration to work with Israel and solidify the gains and perhaps prevent some of the backsliding that happened after the other wars and prevent some of the, I don't know what you call it, pie in the sky, some of the really hopeful but not well-grounded beliefs in the West and in parts of Israel that the war was over. Solidification is the answer. And Israel has started the process, and they have President Trump to work with. And I think for now, that's a positive note, and we're going to end on it. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I think it was a good conversation. I'm always happy to talk to Eric. And next week, we will see you with David Schenker. The details are coming to you shortly. Have a good day. Have a good week. And let me wish you in advance in behind, Chag Sukkot Sameach, and then Simchas Torah Sameach.